They did not wake up one morning intending to ruin something precious. People rarely do. Destruction usually comes dressed as confidence, disguised as certainty, wrapped in the comforting lie that they know better. They looked at you, your patience, your loyalty, your quiet depth, and mistook gentleness for weakness. They convinced themselves that what was solid was dull, that what was faithful was replaceable, that what required care was somehow a burden. And so, with surprising ease, they exchanged something rare for something loud, something shallow, something that sparkled just enough to blind them for a moment. At first, it felt like wisdom to them. Choice often does. It puffs itself up, straightens its back, and declares itself final. They walked away feeling lighter, almost proud, as if discarding you proved their courage. What they did not realize was that value does not shout when it leaves. It withdraws quietly. It does not argue. It does not beg. It simply steps aside and allows consequences to mature in their own time. You, meanwhile, were left standing in the silence of being misjudged. There is a peculiar pain in knowing you were not rejected because you lacked worth, but because you possessed too much of it. Depth unsettles shallow eyes. Constancy irritates restless hearts. You are not too little for them. You are too real, and reality is uncomfortable for those who prefer illusion. What they chose instead promised ease. It required no patience, no growth, no accountability. It mirrored their impulses, flattered their ego, and asked nothing of their character. For a while, it felt like relief. There were no long nights of self-examination, no call to become better, no quiet mirror revealing flaws. Trash, after all, never demands transformation. It simply decays where it lies. But time has a way of removing disguises. The shine faded. The noise grew exhausting. What once felt exciting began to feel empty. They searched for substance where none existed and found only echoes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, regret crept in, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a dull, constant ache. The kind that settles behind the eyes when laughter feels forced and victories taste hollow. That is when memory becomes cruel, not sentimental, but exact. They remember your steadiness when chaos now rules their days. They remember your honesty when lies now circle them like vultures. They remember how you offered peace, not thrills, and only now do they understand the price of peace. It is never appreciated by those who have not yet lost it. Regret does not arrive shouting. It sits quietly beside them in moments of stillness. It appears when distractions fail, when applause ends, when the room grows silent. It whispers uncomfortable truths, that what they discarded was not ordinary, that what they chose cannot sustain them, that what they lost will not return simply because they miss it. You may never hear their apology, you may never see their remorse displayed openly, but do not mistake silence for absence. Regret is heavy. It drags behind every step they take forward, reminding them that some doors close, not because they were locked, but because they were slammed shut from the inside. And here is the quiet irony. While they drown in the weight of what they chose, you are rising, not because you were spared pain, but because you were forced to grow beyond it. What they threw away refined you. What they settled for trapped them. The exchange they thought was clever has revealed itself to be tragic, and the cost is something they will carry far longer than you ever had to. They mistook your gentleness for weakness because they had never learned the discipline required to remain gentle in a harsh world. To them, softness looked like surrender, patience appeared like hesitation, and kindness seemed like a lack of ambition. They had grown accustomed to noise, to force, to people who demanded attention rather than earned respect. In such a frame of mind, your quiet strength was invisible. They could not recognize a power that did not announce itself, because their understanding of strength depended entirely on volume and display. Your depth unsettled them. Depth always does. It asks questions instead of offering distractions. It invites reflection rather than escape. You carried thoughts that reached beneath the surface, emotions that did not vanish at the first inconvenience, and a presence that required sincerity. That kind of depth makes shallow living uncomfortable. It forces people to confront who they are rather than who they pretend to be. And instead of rising to meet that challenge, they chose to label it unnecessary, heavy, or excessive. In their eyes, worth was measured by immediacy, how fast something entertained them, how easily it validated them, how little effort it required to maintain. You did not fit that measure. You required understanding, you required time, you required honesty. And those requirements felt like demands to someone who had built a life around avoiding growth. So rather than admitting their own limitation, they assigned it to you. It was easier to call you weak than to confess they lacked the strength to value you properly. There is a particular blindness that comes with arrogance. It convinces people that what they cannot appreciate must not be valuable. They saw your restraint and assumed you had no fire. They saw your silence and assumed you had nothing to say. They saw your loyalty and assumed it was dependence. What they never realized was that restraint is chosen, silence is deliberate, and loyalty is strongest when it comes from freedom, not fear. You were strong enough to remain calm when provoked, to remain respectful when disappointed, to remain present when it would have been easier to withdraw. That kind of strength does not impress those who survive on drama. They require chaos to feel alive. Stability feels boring to them because it does not feed their need for constant stimulation. In such minds, the steady flame is ignored in favor of the spark that burns bright and dies quickly. They also misunderstood your boundaries. Gentleness does not mean the absence of limits. It means choosing when to stand firm and when to show grace. But they saw grace and assumed permission. They mistook your willingness to understand for a willingness to endure anything. And when you did not harden into bitterness or compete in cruelty, they assumed you were incapable of standing your ground. They were wrong. You simply chose dignity over reaction. Your depth was not something that could be consumed quickly. It required patience to uncover, effort to appreciate, and humility to receive. They were not prepared for that kind of engagement. They wanted convenience, not connection. They wanted affirmation, not truth. And so they turned away from something substantial towards something simpler, convincing themselves that simplicity was superiority. What they failed to grasp is that gentleness is not the opposite of strength. It is its refinement. Anyone can be harsh. Anyone can be careless. Anyone can abandon what challenges them. It takes real strength to remain gentle without becoming naive, to stay kind without becoming invisible, to stay deep in a world that rewards shallowness. Their mistake was not in leaving, but in misunderstanding what they left behind. They believed they were walking away from weakness when, in reality, they were turning their back on a strength they did not yet have the capacity to recognize. And while they moved forward, convinced of their wisdom, you stood as quiet proof that true power does not need to be loud to be unbreakable. They believed walking away from something rare proved their confidence and control, as if departure itself were evidence of strength. To leave, in their mind, was to demonstrate dominance, to show they were not bound, not dependent, not constrained by depth or responsibility. They confused motion with mastery, mistaking the act of choosing for the wisdom of the choice itself. It felt empowering to them, like closing a door before anyone else could decide its worth. There is a seductive illusion in leaving first. It creates the sense that one is always ahead of loss, that rejection cannot wound if you are the one doing the rejecting. By stepping away from you, they told themselves a flattering story that they were bold, decisive, and self-directed. They framed their exit as clarity rather than avoidance, as strength rather than fear. What they never questioned was why strength, in their world, always required escape. Control is often loud in people who lack it internally. They needed to feel in command of the narrative, to believe that every ending was orchestrated rather than endured. Staying would have required vulnerability. Staying would have meant acknowledging uncertainty, complexity, and the possibility that they did not fully understand what they were holding. Leaving allowed them to preserve an image of certainty, even if it was built on denial. You represented something that could not be controlled easily. Your presence was not something they could manage with charm or dismiss with indifference. You reflected back truths they were not ready to face, about consistency, about accountability, about the effort required to maintain something meaningful. That reflection felt threatening. And so, instead of growing into the responsibility, they walked away and called it freedom. At first, their decision felt clean. No immediate consequences, no visible collapse. They moved forward with the confidence of someone who believes endings are final and therefore safe. But confidence built on avoidance is fragile. It holds only as long as distraction lasts. Once the noise fades, the mind returns to unfinished business, and the heart revisits what was never truly understood. True control is not proven by how easily one leaves, but by how deeply one can remain present when things are complex. It is shown in the ability to endure discomfort without running, to stay honest when escape is tempting, to commit without needing constant reassurance. They mistook withdrawal for authority, not realizing that the greatest self-command is often exercised through patience, not departure. Their belief in their own decisiveness depended on not looking back. Reflection would have cracked the illusion. To reconsider would have required humility, and humility was precisely what they lacked in that moment. So they hardened their narrative. They told themselves you were replaceable, the connection was ordinary, the loss insignificant. These stories were not meant to describe reality, they were meant to protect ego. But ego has a short memory and a long shadow. Over time, the sense of control they once felt begins to feel hollow. The confidence fades because it was never rooted in understanding. They begin to notice patterns repeating, connections that never deepen, choices that never satisfy, victories that feel strangely empty, and slowly the realization forms that leaving did not make them powerful, it simply delayed the reckoning. You, on the other hand, were not defined by the exit. You did not need to prove strength through abandonment. Your worth did not depend on dominance or performance. You understood, perhaps painfully, that real confidence is quiet and real control begins within. While they celebrated their departure as proof of superiority, you learned that staying true to yourself, whether someone stays or leaves, is the only form of control that never erodes. Their mistake was believing that walking away elevated them. In truth, it only revealed how uncomfortable they were with depth, commitment, and the kind of strength that does not announce itself. And while they mistook distance for power, you discovered something far more enduring, that no one who truly understands their own worth needs to leave loudly to feel in control. True value leaves quietly because it has no need to persuade anyone of its worth. It does not bargain for recognition or fight to be understood by those who have already decided not to see. When something precious departs, it does so without spectacle, without protest, without the desperate noise of self-defense. That silence is often mistaken for insignificance, but in reality it is restraint. Value understands itself too well to argue with blindness. They expected drama when you stepped back. They anticipated pleading, explanations, maybe even anger, something that would reassure them that they mattered enough to provoke a reaction. But what unsettled them was the absence of noise. Your withdrawal did not confirm their importance. It exposed their miscalculation. They thought loss would look loud. Instead, it looked calm, and calm, to those who thrive on chaos, is deeply disturbing. When something worthless leaves, it leaves mess behind. It scatters blame, stirs confusion, creates conflict, so it will still be remembered. But value does the opposite. It tidies up its presence. It closes the door gently. It removes itself without damaging what remains. That is not weakness. It is discipline. It is the strength of someone who refuses to become ugly simply to be noticed. They mistook your silence as indifference, not realizing it was respect for yourself. You understood that explaining your worth to someone determined to downgrade it would only diminish you, so you chose distance over debate. You chose dignity over justification, and in doing so, you denied them the comfort of believing they were powerful enough to provoke desperation. Quiet departure unsettles people because it leaves them alone with their thoughts. There is no argument to replay, no dramatic ending to blame, only space. And in that space, questions begin to surface. Was the decision wise? Was something meaningful dismissed too quickly? These questions are uncomfortable, so they push them away at first. But silence has patience. It waits. You did not announce your value because value does not depend on witnesses. Gold does not shout from the ground. It waits to be discovered. The truly rare does not advertise itself because it does not need approval to exist. Your absence became the proof they never asked for but could not escape. Not immediately, but inevitably. At first, your quiet leaving made them feel victorious. No resistance meant no challenge, no fight meant no loss, or so they believed. But over time, the lack of noise began to echo. They noticed how nothing replaced what was gone, how conversations felt thinner, how connections felt rushed, how the things they chose instead demanded attention but offered no depth. That is when they began to understand that what leaves quietly takes its richness with it. Silence carries weight when it belongs to something meaningful. It presses on memory. It lingers in moments of comparison. It resurfaces when the world grows still and distractions fail. They realize that what was once steady is now missing, and nothing noisy can compensate for it. You did not beg to be chosen because you knew your worth did not increase by being selected. You did not fight to be kept because you understood that anything that must be fought for by force was already lost in spirit. So you let go, not dramatically, but decisively. That kind of exit requires more strength than confrontation, more courage than accusation. In time, they begin to understand that the quietest losses are the most permanent. Loud endings can be repaired, revisited, rewritten. Silent ones rarely return. They close a chapter without leaving a margin for excuses. And by the time regret recognizes the sound of what has gone missing, it is already too late to call it back. Your quiet departure was not an absence of feeling, it was the presence of self-respect. And while they mistook silence for insignificance, life slowly teaches them the truth, that the most valuable things do not shout when they leave, because they already know what they are worth. You were not rejected because you lacked worth. You were rejected because your worth demanded something they were unwilling to give. This is the truth that takes time to accept, because rejection often disguises itself as judgment. It convinces the heart that something must have been missing, flawed, insufficient. But in your case, the opposite was true. You carried a standard they could not rise to, and instead of growing, they stepped away. Your presence required maturity. It asked for consistency where they preferred convenience. It required integrity where they were comfortable with performance. You did not offer a surface-level connection that could be turned on and off at will. You offered something rooted, something that expected alignment between words and actions. For someone still living in fragments, that kind of wholeness feels like pressure. They did not lack affection, they lacked readiness. They did not fail to see you, they failed to see themselves honestly in your presence. Being close to you would have meant confronting habits they had justified for years, patterns they were not ready to dismantle, and excuses they could no longer hide behind. Rather than face that internal work, they chose the easier path, to redefine your value downward so they could walk away without guilt. It is always tempting to label what challenges us as excessive. Your depth became too much. Your expectations became unfair. Your clarity became intensity. These labels were not descriptions of you, they were defenses against accountability. By shrinking you in their mind, they protected themselves from the discomfort of growth. It is far easier to dismiss someone's worth than to admit one's own limitations. Rejection in such cases is not a verdict. It is a confession. It reveals what someone is incapable of sustaining. They could not maintain honesty without feeling exposed. They could not offer stability without feeling trapped. They could not meet loyalty without fearing responsibility, so they framed their departure as preference rather than inability. But preference chooses freely, inability retreats. You represented a mirror they did not want to look into, not because the reflection was harsh, but because it was clear. You showed them what commitment looked like without drama, what strength looked like without domination, what love looked like without manipulation. And clarity is unbearable to those who rely on confusion to survive. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who reject depth. They surround themselves with options but never experience connection. They mistake availability for abundance and excitement for meaning. Over time, they grow skilled at leaving before being truly known. That habit protects them from vulnerability, but it also starves them of intimacy. And so, when faced with someone who could truly see them and remain, they fled. You were not too demanding. You were simply aligned. You knew what you stood for, what you could offer, and what you would not compromise. That certainty unsettles those who are still negotiating with themselves. They are drawn to clarity, but resent the responsibility it brings. They want the benefits of depth without paying its cost. It hurts to be rejected for being whole in a world that rewards fragments, but wholeness has a strange power. It survives separation. What you are does not diminish because someone walks away. In fact, separation often reveals value more clearly than presence ever could. Distance strips away distortion and leaves only truth. In time, you begin to see that rejection was not removal, it was release. It freed you from shrinking yourself to fit an immature frame. It protected you from entangling your worth with someone still learning how to hold it. And while they walked away believing they had chosen better, life slowly teaches them the difference between comfort and capacity. You were not rejected because you were unworthy. You were rejected because your worth required growth, and they were not ready to grow. Shallow choices feel exciting at first because they ask almost nothing from the person making them. They sparkle with immediacy, offering pleasure without patience and reward without responsibility. In a world trained to crave speed, anything that delivers a quick sensation feels like a victory. The thrill is instant, the validation effortless, and the cost conveniently hidden. That is why such choices feel alive in the beginning. They move fast enough to outrun reflection. Depth, by contrast, slows the pulse. It requires attention, consistency, and a willingness to sit with discomfort while meaning forms. Shallow options bypass all of that. They promise enjoyment without endurance, affirmation without accountability. The mind, tired of effort, welcomes the shortcut. It confuses ease with wisdom and intensity with importance. In that confusion, excitement becomes the measure of value, and anything demanding patience is dismissed as unnecessary weight. There is also an illusion of control embedded in shallow choices. Because they do not demand growth, they never threaten identity. One can enjoy them without changing, engage them without examining oneself. They feel safe precisely because they do not challenge habits, beliefs, or patterns. Growth always unsettles. It rearranges the inner furniture. Shallow pleasures leave everything exactly where it is, which is why they are so attractive to those who fear disruption. At first, the excitement feels liberating. The absence of responsibility creates a sense of freedom. No one is asking for consistency. No one is expecting depth. No one is holding a mirror up to character. The person feels lighter, unburdened, convinced they have escaped something restrictive. But what they have escaped is not constraint, it is meaning. And meaning, unlike excitement, reveals its absence slowly. The initial thrill depends on novelty. When something is new, it can mask its emptiness. Noise fills the silence where substance should be. Distraction replaces connection. Over time, novelty fades, as it always does. What remains is the structure beneath the excitement. If there is nothing there, no shared values, no depth, no growth, the excitement collapses into restlessness. That restlessness is the first sign that the choice was shallow. It appears as boredom that cannot be satisfied, irritation without cause, a constant need for more stimulation. Instead of peace, there is agitation. Instead of fulfillment, there is hunger. The person begins to chase intensity because intensity is the only thing that temporarily numbs the awareness of emptiness. Shallow choices also teach impatience. When gratification comes quickly, waiting feels intolerable. The person becomes less capable of staying with anything that unfolds slowly. They lose the ability to endure silence, to build trust over time, to invest in something that matures rather than dazzles. Depth begins to feel foreign, even threatening, because it does not deliver its rewards on demand. This is why shallow excitement often leads to a cycle of replacement. When one option loses its shine, another is sought. The pattern repeats: brief thrill, fading interest, quiet dissatisfaction. Each replacement promises renewal, but each ends the same way. The person believes the problem lies in the object chosen, never in the habit of choosing shallowly. What they do not realize is that excitement without growth always decays. It has no roots. It cannot withstand time, pressure, or silence. Depth, on the other hand, grows stronger with familiarity. It reveals layers instead of wearing out. It demands effort, but it repays it with stability, meaning, and peace. When they chose excitement over depth, they chose a fire that burns fast and leaves ash. In the beginning, the flames were impressive. Others might have even admired them. But fires like that do not warm long. They consume everything quickly and then vanish, leaving cold behind. You were not boring. You were enduring. You were not heavy. You were substantial. Shallow choices felt exciting because they required no growth, but what requires nothing gives nothing back. And eventually, the person who chose ease over meaning must face the quiet truth that excitement fades, while depth, once lost, cannot be easily replaced. What asks nothing of character eventually offers nothing to the soul. At first, this truth hides itself well. The soul is patient. It does not complain immediately when it is being starved. It tolerates emptiness for a while, mistaking stimulation for nourishment, noise for meaning. But slowly, unmistakably, it begins to weaken. And when it does, no amount of distraction can restore what was never fed. When they chose something that required no integrity, no effort, no self-examination, it felt merciful. Life suddenly seemed easier. There were no standards to meet, no promises to keep, no inward alignment required. Everything was allowed, nothing was demanded. In such an environment, character feels unnecessary, even inconvenient. Why cultivate discipline when nothing tests it? Why develop patience when nothing asks you to wait? Why learn honesty when performance is enough? But character is not built for comfort, it is built for meaning. It grows when resistance is met, when temptation is refused, when responsibility is embraced despite inconvenience. Remove these pressures and character begins to atrophy. Not dramatically, not in ways others notice at first, but internally, where it matters most. The soul begins to lose its sense of direction, because direction requires values, and values require commitment. At first, the absence of demands feels like freedom, yet freedom without structure quickly becomes emptiness. The soul longs to be shaped by something worthwhile. It desires purpose, not permission. When nothing asks anything of you, the days blur together. Pleasure loses its sweetness because it has no contrast. Choices lose their weight because nothing is at stake. Life becomes full, yet strangely hollow. What they chose did not challenge them to become better, only to become comfortable. Comfort is seductive because it whispers that growth is optional. But the soul does not thrive on ease. It thrives on alignment, on knowing that who you are, what you do, and what you believe are moving in the same direction. When actions no longer require integrity, that alignment fractures. The soul feels it long before the mind admits it. This is why people surrounded by indulgence often feel restless. They have everything they thought they wanted, yet they cannot explain the unease. The soul recognizes when it is being neglected. It recognizes when its deeper hunger for truth, connection, purpose is being replaced with substitutes. These substitutes may entertain, but they cannot satisfy. They fill time, not meaning. When nothing demands character, nothing inspires growth. Without growth, identity stagnates. The person begins to repeat themselves, same patterns, same mistakes, same conversations. There is motion, but no progress, activity without evolution, and the soul, designed for becoming, begins to feel trapped in repetition. Over time, this emptiness becomes heavier than effort ever was. The very demands they avoided, honesty, responsibility, depth, begin to look like relief in hindsight. They realize too late that what once felt burdensome was actually formative. It was shaping them, strengthening them, giving substance to their inner life. What replaced it asked nothing and therefore gave nothing. You, however, were not easy because you were demanding for the sake of control. You required character because character is the doorway to meaning. Being close to you required presence, self-awareness, consistency. These were not obstacles, they were invitations to grow, to deepen, to become whole. But invitations can be refused, and when they are, the cost is quiet but severe. The soul cannot live forever on what does not challenge it. It will eventually rebel through dissatisfaction, through regret, through a longing that no new distraction can silence. That longing is not nostalgia, it is hunger. Hunger for what once asked something of them, and in doing so, gave them a sense of purpose they did not know how to name at the time. In the end, they discover that ease is not peace, and freedom without character is not fulfillment. What asks nothing of character leaves the soul underfed and wandering, and by the time they understand this, they are often standing in the wreckage of choices that felt light but proved empty, realizing too late that what they walked away from was not a burden, but nourishment. Time strips illusions because it is patient in a way people are not. It does not argue, persuade, or warn, it simply continues. What once felt convincing under excitement begins to weaken under repetition. The stories they told themselves, that they chose better, that nothing valuable was lost, that replacement was progress, sound confident only when time is short. Given enough days, enough quiet moments, enough repetition of the same emptiness, those stories begin to collapse under their own weight. At first, time seems to cooperate with illusion. Nothing bad happens immediately. There is no punishment, no dramatic fall. Life goes on. This is where false confidence grows. They take the absence of consequences as proof of correctness. They assume that if something were truly valuable, its loss would have caused instant pain. But real loss does not scream. It waits. It lets comfort settle in so that emptiness can later be fully felt. Illusions thrive on novelty. As long as something is new, it distracts from its lack of substance. Time removes novelty. It repeats the same days, the same conversations, the same routines. And repetition is ruthless. It exposes what has depth and what does not. What is shallow cannot survive familiarity. It becomes irritating, dull, even suffocating. What once excited now merely occupies space. This is when the first cracks appear. They notice that joy no longer arrives naturally. Laughter feels thinner. Satisfaction fades faster. They begin to chase stimulation harder, needing more noise to feel the same effect. This escalation is not desire. It is compensation. It is the soul trying to replace what depth once quietly provided. Time also sharpens comparison. When illusions weaken, memory grows clearer. They remember not the fantasy version of you, but the steady presence you were, the calm you brought, the sense of grounding that existed without effort. Memory becomes precise when regret approaches. It highlights contrasts rather than feelings. What once felt too heavy now looks stable. What once felt boring now looks peaceful. Illusions are fragile because they depend on avoidance. They require constant distraction to survive. Time removes distractions by exhausting them. Eventually, even pleasure grows tired. Even excitement loses energy. Silence returns. And in silence, illusion has no defense. It cannot explain itself without noise. It cannot justify itself without motion. This is also when they realize something unsettling, that the emptiness they feel is not caused by loss alone, but by choice. They were not unlucky. They were selective. They chose what felt easier over what was meaningful, and time, relentless and fair, reveals the cost without accusation. It simply lets them live with the result long enough to understand it. What makes this exposure painful is its clarity. There is no one to blame, no dramatic villain, no external force. Just the quiet awareness that something real was dismissed too casually. That realization does not arrive all at once. It seeps in. Through moments that should feel fulfilling but do not. Through achievements that feel strangely hollow. Through company that feels crowded but lonely. Time also reveals permanence. Illusions always feel reversible. They carry the secret belief that things can be undone if needed, but time proves otherwise. Some losses harden into reality. Some doors close not because they were locked, but because they were ignored too long. This is when regret deepens. Not from emotion, but from understanding. Meanwhile, You are no longer where they left you. Time has worked on you differently. What was taken lightly forced you inward. Reflection replaced distraction. Growth replaced justification. While time stripped their illusions, it strengthened your clarity. You learned what you deserved by watching what could not value you. That is the final cruelty of time's honesty. It does not expose illusions equally. It rewards those who chose truth, even painfully, and confronts those who chose comfort, even confidently. One grows quieter but stronger. The other grows louder but emptier. In the end, time does not punish. It reveals. And what it reveals cannot be unseen. The illusion that replacement was progress dissolves. The belief that depth was unnecessary collapses. What remains is the simple, devastating truth that what was dismissed as ordinary was in fact rare, and that no amount of noise can replace what time has already stripped bare. Regret does not announce itself loudly because it has no need to. It arrives without drama, without confrontation, without the satisfaction of being seen. It slips quietly into ordinary moments, disguising itself as fatigue, restlessness, or an unexplained heaviness in the chest. At first, it is easy to ignore. People mistake it for stress, boredom, or the natural weariness of life. But regret is patient. It waits until silence gives it room to speak. It often appears in the moments least expected, in the pause between conversations, in the quiet after laughter fades, in the space where distraction once lived but no longer satisfies. Regret does not shout accusations. It whispers comparisons. It asks questions that were once avoided. What if that choice was wrong? What if something real was lost? What if the ease they chased cost them something irreplaceable? Unlike guilt, regret does not demand immediate correction. Guilt pushes toward action. Regret settles in and stays. It becomes a companion to routine, walking beside daily life, reminding without attacking. That is why it is so difficult to escape. There is no argument to win, no apology that can undo what time has already sealed. Regret is not interested in repair. It is interested in recognition. In the beginning, they try to drown it out. More noise, more activity, more replacement. They convince themselves that if they stay busy enough, the feeling will disappear. But regret is not a feeling that can be outrun. It grows stronger in motionless moments, and exhaustion eventually creates those moments whether one wants them or not. When the mind tires of pretending, regret takes the seat it has been waiting for. What makes regret particularly cruel is its clarity. It does not distort memory, it sharpens it. Moments once overlooked become vivid. The steadiness that was taken for granted becomes precious. The patience that felt ordinary now looks rare. Regret reconstructs the past with precision, not sentimentality. It does not romanticize, it contrasts, and in that contrast, loss becomes undeniable. Regret also carries the weight of finality. It understands what cannot be undone. That is why it speaks softly, because shouting would be pointless. It knows that no amount of longing can reverse a door closed by choice. It simply sits with the truth and waits for the person to do the same. That waiting is unbearable for those who built their lives on avoidance. They begin to notice it in the way joy feels incomplete, in the way success tastes thinner than expected, in the way laughter fades too quickly. Nothing is wrong, yet nothing is right. Regret thrives in that contradiction. It feeds on the awareness that life continues, but something essential is missing from its texture. What they lost was not merely a person or a connection. It was a version of themselves that existed only in the presence of something meaningful. Some relationships awaken parts of us we cannot access alone. When those are discarded, It is not just the other that disappears. It is the self that was formed there. Regret recognizes this loss long before the mind has language for it. They may never speak your name aloud when regret surfaces. It is too vulnerable, too revealing. Instead, it hides behind vague dissatisfaction, behind the sense that something isn't right. But deep down, regret knows exactly what it is mourning. It remembers the moment of choice. It remembers the ease with which value was dismissed, and it replays that memory not to punish, but to remind. Regret is quiet because it is permanent. Loud emotions burn out. Quiet ones endure. It does not need attention to exist. It needs time, and time gives it strength. As years pass, regret grows heavier, not because the loss becomes larger, but because understanding becomes deeper. They see more clearly what they were offered and what they settled for instead. Meanwhile, you are no longer trapped in that regret. Pain visited you, but it did not stay. You were forced to grieve early, to feel deeply, to confront reality without illusion. They postponed that reckoning, and regret is the bill that arrives with interest. It is not dramatic, it is not visible, but it is relentless. Regret does not scream because it does not need witnesses. It sits quietly inside them, faithful and exact, reminding them every time silence falls that some choices echo forever, and that some losses do not need noise to be devastating. Memory becomes painful when comparison replaces comfort. At first, memory feels harmless, almost gentle. It drifts in unexpectedly, carrying fragments rather than conclusions, a tone of voice, a way of listening, a steadiness that once felt ordinary. In the beginning, these recollections do not hurt, they simply pass through, but over time, memory sharpens, not because it grows emotional, but because reality begins to provide contrast. Comparison is what transforms memory into pain. When what they chose begins to reveal its limits, the past gains clarity. Memory no longer floats freely. It stands beside the present and invites examination. This is when the ache begins, not because the past was perfect, but because it was real. It had weight, texture, continuity, and nothing exposes the absence of substance more cruelly than remembering something that once quietly held it together. At first, they resist comparison. They tell themselves it is unfair, that nostalgia exaggerates, that memory lies. But memory is not lying here, it is reporting. It does not embellish, it aligns. It places what existed next to what exists now and lets the difference speak. And the difference speaks clearly. What they once dismissed as nothing special now appears irreplaceable precisely because nothing else has replaced it. Memory becomes exact when comfort disappears. When peace is missing, the mind remembers where peace once lived. When conversations feel hollow, memory recalls depth. When stability is absent, memory points to the last place it existed without effort. This is not longing. It is recognition. The mind is not yearning for the past, it is diagnosing the present. What makes this comparison unbearable is its honesty. There is no villain to blame, no betrayal to justify, only choice. Memory reminds them that they were not deprived. They walked away. That is why the pain deepens. Loss caused by circumstance allows grief to rest. Loss caused by choice refuses to settle. It stays active, unresolved, demanding acknowledgement. They begin to notice it during ordinary moments, when something should feel satisfying but does not, when laughter feels forced, when achievements fail to land. Memory steps in quietly and says, "This is where it used to feel different." That sentence alone is enough to wound. Not dramatically, but deeply. Memory also reveals effort. What they have now requires constant maintenance, constant reassurance, stimulation, adjustment. What they lost required presence, not performance. It held without demanding proof. That realization stings. It exposes how ease was mistaken for effortlessness, and how effortlessness was thrown away because it was misunderstood. There is also a loneliness in comparison that cannot be shared. They cannot easily speak this pain aloud. To do so would require admitting misjudgment, acknowledging loss, confessing immaturity, so the comparison remains internal. It plays out silently, revisiting moments they once overlooked, replaying decisions they once felt proud of. Memory becomes a private reckoning. As time passes, memory grows more selective. It stops recalling arguments and focuses on steadiness. It forgets imperfections and highlights alignment, not because it is idealizing, but because it is isolating what mattered. The mind sifts through the past and keeps what gave structure, not what caused friction. That process is painful because it reveals how little of value was truly present in what replaced it. Comparison also exposes irreversibility. Memory shows them not only what was lost, but what cannot be returned to. Some connections cannot be revisited without distortion. Some doors close not with noise, but with time. This awareness adds weight to memory, transforming it from reflection into regret. Meanwhile, you are no longer living inside that comparison. You are forced to grieve without substitutes. You confronted the loss directly, felt its impact fully, and allowed memory to do its work early. That pain shaped you. It clarified your standards. It taught you the cost of misalignment. While memory punishes them, it has already educated you. Memory hurts them because it arrives late. It comes after illusions collapse, after replacements fail, after time removes distractions. It comes when they are no longer protected by excitement. And by then, memory is no longer gentle. It is precise. Comparison is the blade memory sharpens. It does not scream. It does not accuse. It simply places truth beside truth and lets understanding do the damage. And once that understanding settles in, comfort cannot return easily, because the mind now knows, not emotionally, but clearly, that what was lost was not replaceable, and what was chosen will never feel the same. Memory becomes painful not because the past was perfect, but because the present reveals how deeply it was undervalued. Peace is always underestimated until chaos becomes permanent. While it exists, it feels invisible, almost unremarkable. It does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It simply holds things together quietly, allowing life to move without constant friction. Because peace does not thrill or impress, it is often dismissed as boring, weak, or replaceable. People do not notice it the way they notice excitement, because peace does not stimulate the ego, it stabilizes the soul. When peace was present, it felt normal. There were fewer emotional spikes, fewer dramatic swings, fewer moments of urgency. And because nothing was constantly on fire, they assumed nothing valuable was happening. They mistook calm for emptiness. They mistook stability for stagnation. They did not realize that peace is not the absence of feeling, but the absence of unnecessary suffering. Chaos, on the other hand, is loud. It arrives with intensity, emotion, and urgency. It convinces people they are alive because it keeps them alert. In the beginning, chaos feels exciting. It creates movement. It offers stimulation. It gives the illusion of depth by producing strong reactions. But reaction is not connection, and intensity is not meaning. Chaos only feels rich because it constantly demands attention. At first, chaos feels temporary, something to manage, something to get used to, something that will eventually settle. That belief allows people to tolerate it longer than they should. They tell themselves that every life has turbulence, that discomfort is normal, that rest will come later. What they do not realize is that chaos does not resolve itself without intention. Left unchecked, it becomes a pattern, then an environment, then a permanent condition. This is when peace begins to be remembered, not as dull, but as priceless. They start to notice how exhausting life has become, how every interaction feels loaded, how rest no longer restores, how the mind never fully quiets. Chaos does not simply disrupt circumstances, it invades the inner world. It trains the nervous system to stay alert, suspicious, reactive. Over time, this constant state of tension becomes normal, and that is when the damage deepens. Permanent chaos strips life of softness. There is no room to breathe, no space to reflect, no stillness to recover. Even joy becomes sharp, edged with anxiety, because it never feels secure. People living in chaos are always waiting for the next disturbance. They may laugh, but they are listening for impact. They may succeed, but they are bracing for collapse. This is not living, it is surviving. Only then do they understand what peace was doing all along. It was protecting their energy. It was creating safety without drama. It was allowing growth to happen quietly. Peace was not passive, it was preventative. It stopped small problems from becoming constant battles. It softened life enough to make endurance possible. And because it worked silently, it went unappreciated. Peace also required maturity. It asked for restraint instead of impulse, understanding instead of reaction, commitment instead of escape. These qualities felt restrictive to someone still chasing stimulation. Chaos, by contrast, asked nothing but attention. It allowed impulsiveness, inconsistency, and emotional excess to masquerade as authenticity. That freedom felt intoxicating until it became inescapable. When chaos becomes permanent, comparison finally happens. They remember how it felt to wake up without tension already in the chest, to move through days without constant emotional recalibration, to be understood without having to explain themselves repeatedly. Peace was not perfection, it was alignment, and alignment is something chaos can never provide. By the time they recognize this, peace is no longer easily accessible. It cannot simply be reclaimed by desire. Peace requires structure, discipline, and inner work, the very things they avoided when they first dismissed it. That is the tragedy. Peace is easy to lose and hard to rebuild. Chaos is easy to enter and difficult to escape. You understood peace differently once it was gone. You did not romanticize it. You learned its value through loss. But unlike them, you were forced to rebuild intentionally. You learned to protect calm, to choose environments, people, and rhythms that supported stability. Peace became something you cultivated, not something you took for granted. They, however, learned too late. Chaos surrounded them long enough to become familiar, even when it hurt. And familiarity is dangerous. It convinces people to settle for conditions that slowly erode them. This is the final lesson peace teaches by absence, that what feels quiet today may be the very thing saving you from destruction tomorrow. Peace is always underestimated when it is present, because it does not demand recognition. But once chaos becomes permanent, peace is no longer invisible. It is unforgettable. Apologies are often silent, not because remorse is absent, but because admitting it would require a collapse of the story they told themselves. To say, "I was wrong," would mean dismantling the image they worked so hard to protect, the image of being decisive, justified, and in control. Silence becomes a shield. It hides regret behind pride, distance, or indifference. But silence does not erase remorse. It only buries it, where it grows heavier with time. Many people believe that if an apology is not spoken, then regret must not exist. This is rarely true. Regret does not always seek expression. Often it avoids it. Expression requires vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens identity. To apologize would mean acknowledging that something rare was mishandled, that judgment failed, that ego overruled wisdom. For some, that admission feels more painful than living with quiet remorse. So they carry it privately. It shows up in the way certain topics are avoided, certain names go unspoken, certain memories are quickly dismissed. It appears in defensiveness when the past is mentioned, in discomfort when similar situations arise. Silence becomes crowded with unsaid words. The apology lives there, unvoiced but present, pressing inward instead of outward. There is also fear embedded in silence. Fear that the apology would come too late, fear that it would not be accepted, fear that reopening the door would expose how deeply the loss still hurts. It is easier to remain quiet than to face the possibility of rejection from the very person they once rejected. Silence feels safer even when it is heavier. Remorse carried in silence does not fade. It accumulates. Each time they see something that reminds them of what they lost, steadiness, loyalty, peace, it adds weight. Each time they encounter shallow replacements or repeated disappointments, the unspoken apology grows more precise. It becomes less about emotion and more about understanding. They know clearly what was mishandled, and clarity is painful when action is no longer possible. This is why silent remorse often expresses itself indirectly, through restlessness, through dissatisfaction, through a sense that something is unfinished. They may succeed outwardly, but inwardly there is a quiet imbalance. Something was left unresolved, and unresolved things do not disappear. They linger. The apology they never gave becomes part of their inner landscape, shaping how they experience the present. You may never hear the words, but that does not mean they were never formed. Many apologies are fully articulated internally, rehearsed in moments of honesty, revised in moments of regret, silenced in moments of fear. The absence of sound does not equal absence of meaning. Silence, in this case, is not indifference, it is containment. What makes this remorse particularly heavy is that it cannot be shared without consequence. Speaking it would change the narrative they live inside. It would force them to confront not only the loss, but who they were when the loss occurred. That confrontation requires humility, and humility often comes too late to repair what pride has already broken. Meanwhile, you are not waiting for the apology. You learn to release without receiving validation. You processed the pain openly, felt it honestly, and moved forward without needing them to confirm your worth. That is the quiet difference between your healing and their regret. You carried pain briefly but consciously. They carry remorse indefinitely but silently. The apology they never gave becomes a permanent weight because it has nowhere to go. Words unspoken do not vanish. They settle. They echo inwardly, repeating the same truth, that something valuable was lost, not by fate, but by choice. And while you no longer need acknowledgement to stand whole, they live with the knowledge that some apologies, once withheld too long, can never fully be spoken without reopening wounds time has already sealed. Silence protects pride, but it punishes the one who keeps it. And so their remorse remains, quiet, heavy, and inescapable, while you continue forward unburdened by words you no longer need to hear. While they carry the burden of regret, you rise, not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily. Growth after loss rarely looks dramatic. It unfolds quietly, shaped by reflection, honesty, and the kind of pain that forces clarity. What they discarded became the ground on which you learned your own value more precisely. You did not rise because you were spared suffering. You rose because you faced it without illusion. At first, the pain weighed heavily. There was confusion, self-doubt, the natural instinct to question your worth. But unlike regret, which circles endlessly, pain moves forward when it is acknowledged. You allowed it to speak, you let it teach, and in doing so, you transformed it from something that wounded into something that shaped. What they avoided confronting, you carried openly, and that difference matters. Their regret is heavy because it is passive. It sits inside them, unresolved, demanding attention but offering no direction. It asks questions but leads nowhere. Your pain, by contrast, became active. It pushed you to refine your boundaries, to recognize what you would no longer tolerate, to see clearly the difference between connection and convenience. You did not harden, you clarified. What they carry reminds them of what they lost. What you carry reminds you of who you are. That distinction is everything. Regret anchors a person to the past. Growth roots a person in the present. While they replay decisions, you build discernment. While they compare endlessly, you choose intentionally. While they feel the weight of missed opportunity, you cultivate alignment. Rising does not mean forgetting, it means integrating. You did not erase the experience, you absorbed it. It became part of your wisdom rather than a source of bitterness. You learned that being undervalued does not reduce value, it reveals misplacement. And once you understand that, you stop shrinking to fit spaces that cannot hold you. Their regret deepens because it is tied to identity. It forces them to confront who they were when they chose poorly. That confrontation is uncomfortable, so it remains unresolved. Your growth, on the other hand, required no denial. You saw clearly, adjusted honestly, and moved forward with integrity intact. That is why your progress feels lighter, even though the pain that preceded it was heavy. As you rise, your standards shift naturally. You no longer chase recognition, you recognize alignment. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer mistake familiarity for safety. These changes are quiet, but they are profound. They protect you from repeating the same cycle, from offering depth to those who only want access. Meanwhile, their regret follows them into new spaces. It shows up when new connections fail to satisfy, when replacements fall short, when excitement fades quickly. No matter how far they go, regret travels with them, because it was never processed, it was postponed. You processed pain early. They postponed understanding, and postponed understanding becomes permanent weight. Rising also means becoming less visible to those who once overlooked you. Growth does not announce itself to the past. It does not seek validation from those who could not value it before. You move differently now. You speak less, observe more, choose with intention. This quiet confidence is not learned from success, it is forged in disappointment. They may one day notice the distance, not just physical, but existential. You are no longer accessible in the same way, not because you hardened, but because you matured. And maturity is often mistaken for coldness by those who benefited from your openness without honoring it. In the end, the contrast is clear. They live with the echo of what they lost. You live with the clarity of what you gained. Their regret weighs them down because it looks backward. Your growth lifts you because it moves forward. And while they remain tethered to a choice they cannot undo, you step freely into a future shaped by lessons you did not waste. What they threw away became your foundation. What they settled for became their lesson. And without needing revenge, without needing explanation, life completed the exchange. In the end, the story was never about what they chose over you, but about what that choice revealed. They believed they were selecting freedom, excitement, and control, unaware that they were trading substance for noise and depth for convenience. What they dismissed as ordinary carried the quiet power of peace, integrity, and meaning, things that do not impress quickly but endure relentlessly. Only with time did the weight of that exchange become clear. You were not defeated by being left behind. You were refined by being released. The separation stripped away illusion, sharpened your self-respect, and taught you the difference between being wanted and being valued. While they circle the memory of what they lost, you walk forward with clarity, no longer offering your depth to those who cannot hold it. You do not need to be chosen by those who choose shallowly. Regret follows them because it was never faced. Growth carries you because pain was not avoided. That is the quiet justice of life. What is ignored returns heavier, and what is confronted becomes lighter. You did not win by replacing them, by proving anything, or by watching them fall. You won by becoming whole without them. And perhaps that is the final truth they will one day understand, if they are honest enough to face it, that what they traded away was not just a person, but a chance to grow, to be steady, to live with peace instead of constant hunger. Some losses cannot be reversed. They can only be understood. You understood. They are still learning.